I imagine there's been a lot to talk about here lately with the state of the farm economy, and that's sort of how we're going to attack that in today's episode is sort of under that umbrella. We do have some listeners, though, that are not closely connected to the farm. Maybe they're students or they're kind of entering agriculture for the first time. For those folks that maybe need just a brief kind of how do we get here answer, can you give us a little bit of context for our conversation today about what's going on in the farm economy?
Well, we call it the roller coaster chart, and many folks recognize it is a tractor looking like it's on a roller coaster. And this chart is really helpful because it works through the cycle of production in agriculture. And there's 5 or 6 different phases in this production cycle. But what generally happens is we have a stable era, boom eras, and we call the margin squeeze, which feels like a bust. Then there's the recovery, and then we go back to a stable era. And that chart's based on what we see in net farm income that the USDA reports, and producers will feel this and observe this throughout their careers. There are years, and they're usually back to back, and they could last for decades, where you don't change things much from year to year. In fact, I always kind of make the joke that you're in a stable era in agriculture when you can take last year's budget, livestock budget, crop budget, cash flow budget, change the data at the top and get it past your lender. Now, we're not in one of those environments today by any stretch of the imagination. You can't even use last month's estimates. So those stable eras, those are where we spend a lot of time, and those are difficult for their own sets of reasons. But there's historically been some stable eras, and arguably we had one of those in the 90s and early 2000s, and maybe briefly between 2015 and 2017 and 18. But that last period had a lot of uncertainty in that as well. But what really gets things going in the farm economy is not usually weather by itself, it's demand shocks. And these demand shocks can be like we had recently when after COVID, we had China buying a lot of corn and a lot of soybeans going into the fuel supply. Before then, we had China buying soybeans and corn going to ethanol. And then, of course, in the 70s, we had a really strong run of farm income when the USSR stole the winter wheat crop, and that kicked off all sorts of inflationary challenges throughout that decade. And then we also see after World War I and after World War II, there's a lot of demand for ag products as Europe's rebuilding and recovering from those terrible challenges that they faced on the continent. And so when you look at the history of agriculture, there just aren't that many boom years. And we look at this as a standard deviation that gets way up there. So if we're at about $100 billion in net farm income on average, it's farm incomes that are above 130 or 140 or 150. We were at 200 billion a couple of years ago. That's the highest single point observation we've had in the past 95 years. So this is sort of the context, is we had a really big run up in commodity ag prices after 2020. We had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We had China buying a lot of corn. We had a lot of soybeans. We were looking at domestic crush for soybeans going up a lot, and stocks got tight. And we saw profits go up. You had really low interest rates. If you really want to have a boom in farmland values, you need to have really strong income and really low interest rates. And we had those in spades. And so we got all that excitement and all that enthusiasm, and it kind of peaked in 2022. And now we're sort of unraveling that, unwrapping that. Eventually, the world does figure out a way to oversupply agricultural products. We bring more farmland on production. We bring more animals into the production system. And so we've sort of moved past that, at least for the time being. And we're now dealing with a situation where commodity prices have fallen faster than the cost of production. And so producers are facing this margin squeeze. And that's where we're at, is sort of how do producers navigate the next few years of tightening their costs, trying to find where that commodity prices might stabilize. Where can we count as a new normal price? And then how do we start to put together plans and budgets and sort of long-term plans that we can start to grow our business from that? Because at this point, during this margin squeeze, it's just sort of, how do we get through this year? How do we get through next year? And how do we find where that new equilibrium might be?
I appreciate that. And for this unraveling to stabilize, this margin squeeze to stabilize, does it take another demand shock, or will it slowly unwind until it starts to stabilize for the most efficient producers and kind of go from there?
Well, that's a really great question. And one of the big unknowns is how low commodity prices are going to have to go. We look really carefully at costs of production. And as economists, we believe that in the long run, economic production costs will roughly equal the commodity price. And so that's where we're looking at. And economic costs are a cost that economists care a lot about, but most people in the real world don't think about that. Economic costs really means we have charged every asset and every piece of labor and every acre and every land. We've given a charge to that into the budget. So it's a full cost. And so, even if you own your land or you rent your land, we're putting in a cost for that. And so we can watch commodity prices and we can watch costs of production, and we're looking for those two things to sort of stabilize. Generally, what happens is these demand shocks tell the world we do not have enough acreage or we do not have enough animals. It takes really big profits, really big economic profits, like I talked about earlier, going from 100 billion to 200 billion. That's a doubling of profits. Now, those profits aren't exactly walking around money. Farmers have to pay family living out of that. They have to service their debt with it. But that doubling is an economic signal that producers in the US and around the world get. And so they try to figure out ways to expand production. And in the US, we mostly lean in through efficiencies or maybe some double cropping. We try to bump yields just a little bit. It's hard in the US, but around the world, they bring on more acres. And eventually, we get enough supply brought online and there's an oversupply. So going back to your question, it really depends on how much oversupply, how much overcapacity there is in the system. It took us a long time in the 1980s. In fact, the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, was sort of a domestic attempt to rein in production. And we had a lot of ending stocks in the 1980s, and that really fueled and added that crisis during that era. But in general, we got to watch it. How is global expansion unfolding? How are our global stocks stabilizing? And, where do the costs of production really need to go? Luckily, producers, especially in the Corn Belt, corn, soybeans, wheat, have benefited from lower fertilizer prices. And so that might have helped out a lot. But if we see prices continue to work their way lower, it's going to be more painful as producers have got to work on fixed costs, those costs that are more specific and unique to their operation.
Have things really changed so drastically that, in the global supply and demand, have we brought on that many new acres, or has demand, decreased by that much to go from such high net farm income to where we are today? And is this a permanent shift, or, what we're talking about here, I guess, is that it's not a permanent shift, it's part of the cycle?
Right. One of the things that we keep an eye on is world harvested acres. And those do not increase linearly over time. Well, let's back up for a second. The first thing that chart busts, the first myth it busts, is that farmland's a good investment because they're not making any more of it. That might be true from a biological standpoint, from a rocks grinding away standpoint. But economists believe that we can find new ways to bring production ag online. So that's the first thing that graph tells us. The second thing it tells us is it's not linear. We see, periods where we bring a lot of acreage on, like in the 70s and like the mid 2000s to 2015. And then the last couple of years, we bring on a lot of acres around the world. And then there are big pauses. And so South America and Ukraine, interestingly, parts of the former Soviet Union, and then even India has been bringing more acreage online. And that's starting to slow down a little bit, especially Ukraine, that Ukraine has lost acres, but those adding. And so, yes, those additions do add up. But what makes the income story in the commodity price situation so dramatic is what we call the elasticity. And so it's the fact that a very small change in quantities has a really big change in commodity prices. And so producers know this intuitively. You can kind of stick around. Let's go back to corn for an example. Corn ending stocks, if they're hanging out around 10 to 15%, commodity prices are going up and down, but they're not dramatically moving. But all of a sudden the world wakes up and says, we don't have enough corn. Prices go up a lot. And all of a sudden we have too much corn and prices go down a little. It's kind of like Goldilocks, right? The porridge is either too hot, too cold, or just right. Elasticities in agriculture tells us that whenever we move from just right to too little or too much, that's what gives us these really, really big changes. And, if you think back to the 1980s farm crisis, that was a situation where we had too much and it was obvious we were going to have too much for multiple years. So when the markets don't have the markets are worried about the current situation and they don't see a clear answer, that's when we see dramatic responses. Because A, we got to either bring more acreage online, or B, we got to, encourage economically end users to find alternatives or be more efficient or just use less of it. The cure for high prices is high prices. The cure for low prices is low prices. And that is very true in ag. And it's because of that inelasticity of the production system.
If you're talking to a farmer, which I know you do regularly, at least through your newsletter, and then I'm sure through other conversations as well, and they say, well, just holding on kind of sucks, right? Just hoping it gets better kind of sucks. Help me keep perspective here why, I should stay optimistic that this cycle, it's not different this time. This cycle is going to come back around like it has in the past.
Well, I think the first step is where are we headed, right? And we're not headed back to a boom. I don't ever want anybody to think in fact, if you look at the farm income history, there was, the 40s and 50s, and then we went to a stable era. Then we had a spike in the 70s, and then we went to a stable era. Then it wasn't until the mid 2000s. So these booms tend to be pretty far apart. There's nothing saying there couldn't be one right around the corner, but the idea is they're somewhat rare, they're somewhat infrequent. It depends on how much yields increase, how much demand increases, how much acreage changes. So there's a rhythm to that. But we're going back to a stable era. And the stable era is this idea of, very little, if any, economic profits in the long run. And this idea that you're able to make, decades worth of income in a very short period of time, that is probably where we're going to be going. So producers need to kind of be realistic about where we're headed. And that at zero economic profits, you're getting a return on all those assets and resources utilized. And so you're going to be able to grow your net worth. And if you're able to get your cost of production even lower, you can make some economic profits. I always tell producers at zero economic profits, your accountant's probably going to give you a tax bill, right? Like this is the way that works out. The point here is the margin squeeze is what we want to get out of. And that's going to take cost cutting. And at this point, it's a little unclear how much of the cost cutting is going to come out of the variable costs, the things that we get price sheets for, and how much of it's going to come out of the things that we do around the farmstead, our family living, our labor, our machinery, our cash rents, and our farmland values.